Story 1. My name is Marcus, and back in the autumn of 2021, I was a 17-year-old high school senior living in a quiet suburban town just outside of Columbus, Ohio. Like many seniors looking to build up their resumes for college applications, I had joined several extracurricular activities. One of them was the school's yearbook committee, because we had a strict deadline to submit the final layout of the autumn sports section to the printing company. My advisor allowed me to stay late in the school's computer lab on Friday evenings. The school usually locked its main doors at 5 o'clock, but since the head night janitor, a friendly older man named Mr. Henderson, knew me well, he would let me work until 9 p.m. before locking up the entire campus. It was a chilly Friday evening in late November. By 8 o'clock, the entire massive high school campus was completely dead and silent. The sprawling hallways, which were usually filled with the chaotic noise of hundreds of students, were completely dark, illuminated only by the faint green glow of the emergency exit signs. The computer lab was located on the second floor of the main building, down a long, narrow corridor. I was sitting in the back of the room, completely focused on editing photos on a large monitor, wearing my noise-canceling headphones with some ambient music, playing softly to help me concentrate. Around 8:30, I felt a sudden vibration through the floorboards. I took off my headphones and turned around, expecting to see Mr. Henderson pushing his cleaning cart down the hallway. Instead, the silence of the school was absolute. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just the heavy ventilation system kicking on. I put my headphones back on and returned to my work. A few minutes later, I noticed a shadow pass across the translucent glass window of the computer lab door. I took off my headphones again, standing up from my desk. "Mr. Henderson, is that you?" I called out, my voice sounding incredibly small in the empty room. There was no verbal response. I walked slowly over to the door, unlocked it, and stepped out into the dark hallway. The air in the corridor felt unusually cold. I shined my phone's flashlight beam down the long row of lockers. Nobody was there. However, at the far end of the hallway, near the heavy double doors that led to the central staircase, I noticed something that immediately made my stomach tighten with anxiety. Mr. Henderson's massive cleaning cart was sitting completely abandoned in the middle of the floor. The mop was still soaking in the bucket, and his master key ring was hanging from the handle. Mr. Henderson never left his keys behind. They were required to access every secure room in the facility. "Mr. Henderson?" I called out again, walking toward the cart. As I reached the cart and picked up the key ring, I heard a faint, wet, dragging sound coming from inside the darkened boys' restroom just a few feet away. It was accompanied by a low, wet wheezing sound that didn't sound healthy at all. Fearing that the elderly janitor had suffered a medical emergency, like a stroke or a heart attack, I pushed the heavy restroom door open, using my phone's light to illuminate the interior. The beam of my light immediately hit the tiled floor. A thick trail of dark red blood was smeared across the white porcelain tiles, leading directly toward the large handicap stall at the back of the room. Slipped underneath the stall door were Mr. Henderson's distinct leather work boots. He was lying completely motionless on his side. "Mr. Henderson," I gasped, rushing forward and violently throwing the stall door open. My chest tightened in pure, unadulterated horror. Mr. Henderson was indeed lying there, his throat brutally slashed, his eyes staring blankly into space. But he wasn't alone in the restroom. Kneeling over his body was a young man wearing a filthy, oversized black hoodie and a crude, homemade plastic mask painted with a grotesque, mocking, smiley face. In his right hand, he was holding a long, industrial box cutter, the silver blade dripping with fresh blood. The moment I threw the stall door open, The masked intruder slowly turned his head toward me. He let out a low, unsettling hiss through the mouth hole of the mask, and his body began to twitch violently with excitement. Adrenaline exploded through my veins. I didn't think. I dropped the janitor's keyring and spun around, sprinting out of the restroom into the dark hallway. Behind me, I heard the heavy, rapid footsteps of the killer slamming the restroom door open and chasing after me. The metallic clicking sound of the box cutter blade being pushed out further echoed horribly against the lockers. Click, click, click. I knew I couldn't make it down the main staircase in time. The killer was moving with terrifying, unnatural speed. Instead, I ran in the opposite direction, sprinting back into the computer lab, slamming the heavy wooden door shut, and twisting the deadbolt lock just as the killer threw his body weight against the outside of the door. Bam! The wood groaned under the immense impact. The killer began violently hacking at the wooden door handle with his box cutter, trying to shatter the mechanism. I frantically searched the room for a weapon or an escape route. The computer lab windows were completely sealed and made of reinforced safety glass. I couldn't break them. I crawled underneath a large corner desk, hiding behind a rows of computer towers, trembling violently, tears streaming down my face. My phone screen showed that I had 0 cellular service inside the reinforced concrete core of the building. I was completely trapped. Outside, the violent banging on the door suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was terrifying. Through the small gap beneath the computer lab door, I could see the shadow of the killer's boots. He was standing perfectly still. Then I heard a metallic jangling sound. My heart stopped. I had dropped Mr. Henderson's master key ring in the hallway right outside the restroom. I watched in absolute despair as a heavy brass key slid into the computer lab lock from the outside. The lock clicked open. Click. The door slowly swung open, the hinges creaking loudly. The masked figure stepped into the dark room, his blood-stained box cutter glinting in the faint green light of the exit sign. He began walking slowly between the rows of desks, dragging the blade of the knife across the plastic monitor screens, creating a horrifying scratching sound. Screech, screech. He knew I was in the room, and he was intentionally playing a psychological game with me. I can hear your heart beating, Marcus. A raspy, distorted voice whispered from behind the mask. He had seen my name on my yearbook binder left on the main desk. He was getting closer and closer to my corner. His boots were now just one row of desks away from where I was squeezed behind the computer towers. I knew that if I stayed there, I would die just like Mr. Henderson. I needed to create a distraction. I reached my arm sideways, grabbed a heavy metal desk stapler from a nearby shelf, and threw it with all my strength toward the opposite side of the lab, where it crashed loudly against a glass whiteboard. The killer spun around instantly, lunging toward the source of the noise. The moment his back was turned, I scrambled out from under the desk and sprinted toward the open door. The killer realized he had been tricked, letting out an angry roar, and turned to chase me. As I flew out of the room, I grabbed the heavy metal door frame and violently slammed the door behind me. Catching the killer's hand in the frame, I heard a sickening crunch of fingers followed by a shriek of pain, causing him to drop the box cutter inside the lab. I didn't look back. I flew down the central staircase, ran through the main lobby, and used the emergency exit crash bar to explode out into the freezing night air. The school's loud security alarm began to blare across the campus. I ran all the way to a residential street a quarter-mile away, where a passing motorist saw my panicked state and dialed 911. A massive convoy of police cruisers and K-9 units swarmed the high school. Within 10 minutes, They discovered Mr. Henderson's body in the restroom, but the killer had managed to escape through a fire exit at the back of the gymnasium. The investigation revealed that the intruder was a highly dangerous 21-year-old drifter who had been hiding inside the school's massive crawl spaces and ventilation shafts for over 3 weeks, stealing food from the cafeteria pantry at night. He had chosen that specific evening to strike because he knew the building would be empty. He was apprehended 2 months later in a neighboring state. I never stayed late at school ever again, and to this day, the sound of a clicking blade completely paralyzes me with fear. Story 2. This next story happened to a girl named Chloe and her roommate, Sarah, during their sophomore year at a large university in upstate New York in the winter of 2022. We were both 20 years old and lived in an old 4-story brick dormitory building that housed about 50 students. Because it was the final week of December, almost the entire student body had already left the campus to go home for the winter break holidays. However, because Sarah and I both worked part-time jobs at a local medical clinic, we had permission from the housing office to stay in our third-floor dorm room for an extra 4 days after the official closing of the campus. By Sunday night, our dormitory was completely desolate. Out of the 50 students who lived there, Sarah and I were the only human beings left in the entire 4-story structure. The university had dialed down the building's heating system to save energy, making the long concrete hallways freezing and drafty. A severe blizzard had struck the region, coating the brick exterior in a thick layer of ice and causing the old window frames to rattle violently against the winter wind. Around 11 o'clock at night, Sarah and I were sitting on our respective twin beds, studying for our remaining online certification exams. The atmosphere inside the building was intensely isolating. The silence was so heavy that we could hear the old water pipes groaning inside the walls from 2 floors away. Suddenly, a strange, rhythmic thumping noise echoed from the hallway outside our room. Thump. 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 It didn't sound like normal footsteps. It sounded like something heavy being dragged down the concrete floor. Stopping every few seconds, Sarah looked up from her laptop, her expression filled with concern. Did the housing office say anyone else was staying on our floor? She asked softly. No, they said we were completely alone in the building, I replied, a cold knot of dread forming in my chest. The thumping sound stopped directly outside our door, room 312. We sat in absolute silence, staring at the brass doorknob. A few seconds passed, and then something began to heavily scratch against the wooden surface of our door. It sounded like long, sharp fingernails dragging slowly down the wood grain. Screech. Sarah began to tremble, her face turning completely pale. I slowly slid off my bed, walked silently across the linoleum floor, and pressed my eye against the door's wide-angle peephole. The hallway was dimly lit by a flickering fluorescent light tube. Standing directly outside our door was a woman. She was wearing a filthy, tattered white nightgown, despite the freezing temperature of the corridor, and her long, tangled black hair completely covered her face. Her bare feet were purple from the cold, and she was holding a heavy ceramic coffee mug in her hands. As I watched through the glass, she slowly raised her head, parting her hair. Her eyes were completely wide, unblinking, and entirely devoid of sanity. She had deep, bloody scratches carved into her own cheeks. The moment I looked through the peephole, as if she could sense my presence on the other side, her gaze locked directly onto the tiny glass lens. She smashed her face hard against the outside of our door, letting out a loud, piercing shriek that sounded like a dying animal. Sarah let out a loud scream, jumping off her bed. The crazed woman outside began violently throwing her body weight against our door, rattling the basic lock mechanism. Bang, bang, bang. Let me in. It's freezing out here. Let me in, she screamed in a raspy, cracked voice. Go away, we are calling the police. I yelled through the door, my voice shaking with pure panic. Sarah grabbed her cell phone and frantically dialed 911. To our absolute horror, the operator informed us that due to the severe blizzard conditions, all local roads were completely blocked by snowdrifts and jackknifed semi-trucks. The nearest patrol car was at least 45 minutes away. We were entirely on our own in an empty building with a lunatic trying to break in. Suddenly, the violent banging on our door stopped. Through the peephole, I watched the woman turn around and walk away, dragging her feet down the hallway until she disappeared around the corner, toward the communal kitchen area. We let out a temporary sigh of relief, but we knew we weren't safe. The basic lock on our door was incredibly flimsy. Within 5 minutes, our relief turned to absolute terror. We heard a loud shatter of glass coming from the communal kitchen down the hall. The kitchen had a large exterior window that led to an iron fire escape walkway on the side of the building. The woman had broken the window. A moment later, the building's central fire alarm system began to blare with a deafening roar. Beep, 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 beep. The red strobe lights began flashing violently in our room, blinding our vision. The woman had intentionally pulled the manual fire alarm lever in the hallway. In a dormitory building, when the fire alarm is activated, an automatic emergency safety override triggers, which instantly unlocks every single electronic and magnetic door lock in the facility to allow students to escape a fire. Our dorm room door's secondary latch clicked open automatically. The door swung wide open, revealing the smoke-filled hallway. Standing in the doorway was the crazed woman. But she wasn't holding the coffee mug anymore. She had broken a large glass shard from the kitchen window, and she was gripping it tightly, her hand bleeding profusely onto the floor. Time to come outside. Girls, she giggled, stepping into our room, swinging the sharp glass shard wildly. Survival instinct took over. Sarah and I grabbed our heavy, wooden desk chairs and held them out in front of us like shields, screaming at her to back down. The woman lunged forward with terrifying ferocity, driving the glass shard deep into the wooden backing of Sarah's chair, splintering the frame. The force of the blow knocked Sarah backward onto the floor. Before the woman could strike again, I lunged forward with my chair, using all my strength to push her backward. The legs of my chair caught her chest, slamming her hard against our large wardrobe unit. She stumbled, losing her footing on the slick linoleum. Sarah quickly scrambled to her feet, and together, we ran past the dazed woman out into the flashing red hallway. We didn't take the elevator. We ran down the concrete emergency stairwell, the deafening fire alarm ringing in our ears. We could hear the woman screaming angrily from 2 floors above us, her bare feet slapping loudly against the concrete steps as she chased us down the dark stairwell. We reached the first-floor lobby, ran to the main entrance and threw the heavy doors open, collapsing out into the blinding white snowstorm outside. We ran through the deep snow drifts toward the main university security gatehouse located a quarter mile away. The security guards saw us freezing and crying, pulled us inside, and immediately armed themselves. When a heavy force of university, police, and state troopers arrived at our dormitory 30 minutes later, they found the building completely trashed. The woman was discovered hiding inside our room's closet, surrounded by our shredded clothes and personal photos. The investigation revealed that she was a highly dangerous patient who had walked out of a local private psychiatric ward during the chaos of the blizzard. She had entered our building through an unlatched basement maintenance door. If the university hadn't arrived when they did, she would have waited for us in the dark. Sarah and I moved out of that dormitory the very next semester. The sound of a fire alarm still makes my heart skip a beat. Story 3. Our final story takes place in the spring of 2023 at a prestigious Ivy League university campus in New England. My name is Julian, and I was a 24-year-old graduate student completing my master's thesis in historical architecture. Because my research required access to rare, ancient manuscripts that could not leave the university's underground archive library, I spent almost all my nights inside the basement levels of the campus library. This specific library was a massive, Gothic-style stone structure built in the late 19th century, featuring 5 floors above ground and 3 extensive subterranean levels beneath the earth. It was a rainy Tuesday night, around 2:30 in the morning. The main floors of the library had closed at midnight, but graduate students with special electronic keycards were permitted 24-hour access to the subterranean research carrels on Level B3. Level B3 was an incredibly creepy, silent place. It consisted of rows of towering steel shelves filled with millions of old, decaying books, separated by narrow concrete corridors with dim, motion-activated neon lighting. I was the only student working down there that evening. Around 3 a.m., I decided to take a break from my reading. I stood up from my small wooden desk, stretching my arms, and walked down the main aisle to find a textbook on colonial foundation structures. The motion sensors clicked on as I walked, illuminating the dusty shelves one by one. As I reached the end of aisle 14, the lights at the far end of the corridor suddenly flickered and shut off completely, plunging the back of the basement into total darkness. I assumed a fuse had blown in the ancient electrical grid. I turned around to walk back to my desk, but then I heard a distinct sound coming from the darkness behind me. Flip, flip, flip. It was the unmistakable sound of someone rapidly flipping through the pages of a heavy book in the dark. I stopped walking, my heart rate elevating slightly. "Hello, is someone else down here?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the heavy concrete walls. The page flipping sound stopped instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then a low, rasping male voice emerged from the shadows of aisle 14. "Julian, you have the book I need." A chill of pure terror ran down my spine. I had never told anyone my name, nor had I logged my research topic on any public campus forum. How did this person know who I was? And what were they doing in a secure, card-access-only basement at 3 in the morning? Before I could reply, the motion lights in the adjacent aisle clicked on. Standing under the pale white light was a man. He was wearing an ancient, faded university graduation gown that was covered in dirt and old mold stains. His face was incredibly gaunt, his skin paper thin, and his eyes were completely wide and hollow, dilated to an unnatural size. In his right hand, he was holding a massive, heavy iron fire poker tool that he must have stolen from the building's main lobby fireplace. I realized instantly that this man wasn't a student or a professor. He was a deeply disturbed intruder who had bypassed campus security. "I need your research, Julian," the man whispered, his face twisting into a horrific, jagged smile. He raised the iron fire poker over his shoulder and began walking toward me, accelerating into a rapid, awkward sprint. I spun around and ran as fast as I could down the central concrete corridor toward the main elevator bank. Behind me, I could hear the heavy iron tool smashing against the steel bookshelves as he chased me. Clang, clang, clang. The impact sent heavy historical volumes raining down onto the floorboards. I reached the elevator lobby, frantically slamming my thumb onto the call button. The digital screen showed that the elevator cab was currently on the 5th floor, moving down incredibly slowly. Level B3 had no cellular phone service, and the emergency intercom system on the wall had a yellow tag that read, "Out of order for maintenance." I was completely trapped in a subterranean bunker with an armed lunatic. The intruder emerged from the book aisles, his face glistening with sweat under the pale neon lights. He saw me standing by the elevator and let out a loud, maniacal laugh, swinging the iron poker through the air, creating a terrifying whistling sound. "No exit, Julian," he screamed, lunging forward. I knew I couldn't wait for the elevator. I spun to my left, ran through a heavy metal door marked "Emergency, Stairs Only," and began sprinting up the concrete steps toward the ground level. The door slammed shut behind me, but within seconds, I heard the heavy crash of the intruder throwing his body against the door, pursuing me up the stairwell. The concrete stairs were narrow and steep. I could hear the metallic clanging of the iron tools striking the metal handrails just a few steps behind me. Clang, clang. The man was moving with a frantic, desperate energy that defied his gaunt appearance. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like lead as I cleared level B2 and raced toward level B1. As I reached the B1 landing, my foot caught on a stray piece of construction rubber left on the steps. I tumbled forward, crashing heavily onto my knees and elbows, my phone flying out of my hand and shattering against the concrete wall. The intruder caught up to me instantly. He stood over my fallen body on the landing, his hollow eyes filled with an intense, murderous rage. He raised the massive iron fire poker high above his head, preparing to bring it down directly onto my skull. In a final desperate act of survival, I swung my leg backward with all my remaining strength, delivering a powerful kick directly into the man's shin bone. I felt the satisfying impact of my heavy leather boot connecting with his leg. The man let out a sharp shriek of agony, losing his balance on the steep concrete step. He tumbled backward down the flight of stairs, crashing violently against the metal handrails before landing heavily on the B2 concrete floor below. The heavy iron tool flew out of his hand, clattering away into the darkness. I didn't waste a single second. I scrambled back to my feet, ignored the intense pain in my knees, and sprinted up the final flight of stairs to the ground floor exit. I threw the heavy push-bar door open, collapsing into the main lobby of the library, where the night security guards were sitting at the front desk. "Help! There's an armed man in the basement stairwell," I screamed, collapsing onto the marble floor, gasping for breath. The guards immediately pulled out their batons, locked down the building's exits, and contacted the city police department. Within 5 minutes, a large tactical team raided the subterranean levels. They discovered the intruder crawling through the B2 book aisles, his legs severely fractured from the fall, still searching for a weapon. The police investigation revealed a terrifying truth. The man was a former professor of antiquities who had been fired from the university 10 years prior after losing his sanity. He had become obsessed with a specific historical manuscript that he believed contained hidden codes, and he had been living inside the library's ancient, forgotten boiler rooms beneath level B3 for nearly 6 months. He had been tracking my research through the library's internal local network, waiting for the perfect night to murder me and steal my notes. He was permanently committed to a maximum security forensic asylum. I finished my master's thesis from the safety of my apartment. Some histories are meant to stay buried in the dark, and I will never step foot inside an underground library ever again.